The Godhead is impassible, for where there is perfection and unity, there can be no suffering. The capacity to suffer arises when there is imperfection, disunity, and separation from an embracing totality, and the capacity is actualized to the extent that imperfection, disunity, and separateness are accompanied by an urge towards the intensification of these creaturely conditions. For the individual who achieves unity within his own organism and union with the divine ground, there is an end of suffering. The goal of creation is the return of all sentient beings out of separateness and that infatuating urge to separateness which results in suffering through unitive knowledge into the wholeness of eternal reality. The elements which make up man produce a capacity for pain. The cause of pain is the craving for individual life. Deliverance from craving does away with pain. The way of deliverance is the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. The urge to separateness, or craving for independent and individualized existence, can manifest itself on all the levels of life, from the merely cellular and physiological through the instinctive to the fully conscious. It can be the craving of a whole organism for an intensification of its separateness from the environment and the divine ground. Or it can be the urge of a part within an organism for an intensification of its own partial life as distinct from, and consequently at the expense of, the life of the organism as a whole. In the first case, we speak of impulse, passion, desire, self-will, sin. In the second, we describe what is happening as illness, injury, functional, or organic disorder. In both cases, the craving for separateness results in suffering, not only for the craver, but also for the craver's sentient environment, other organisms in the external world, or other organs within the same organism. In one way, suffering is entirely private. In another, fatally contagious. No living creature is able to experience the suffering of another creature, but the craving for separateness which, sooner or later, directly or indirectly, results in some form of private and unshareable suffering for the craver, also results, sooner or later, directly or indirectly, in suffering, equally private and unshareable for others. Suffering and moral evil have the same source, a craving for the intensification of the separateness which is the primary datum of all creatureliness. Let us consider first suffering inflicted by living organisms on themselves and other living organisms in the mere process of keeping alive. The cause of such suffering is the craving for individual existence, expressing itself specifically in the form of hunger. Hunger is entirely natural, a part of every creature's dharma. The suffering it causes alike to the hungry and to those who satisfy their hunger is inseparable from the existence of sentient creatures. The existence of sentient creatures has a goal and purpose which is ultimately the supreme good of every one of them. But meanwhile, the suffering of creatures remains a fact and is a necessary part of creatureliness. Insofar as this is the case, creation is the beginning of the fall. The consummation of the fall takes place when creatures seek to intensify their separateness beyond the limits prescribed by the law of their being. On the biological level, the fall would seem to have been consummated very frequently during the course of evolutionary history. Every species, except the human, chose immediate, short-range success by means of specialization. But specialization always leads into blind alleys. It is only by remaining precariously generalized that an organism can advance towards the rational intelligence which is its compensation for not having a body, and instincts perfectly adapted to one particular kind of life and one particular kind of environment. Rational intelligence makes possible unparalleled worldly success on the one hand, and on the other a further advance towards spirituality and a return through unitive knowledge to the divine ground. Because the human species refrained from consummating the fall on the biological level, human individuals now possess the momentous power of choosing either selflessness and union with God, or the intensification of separate selfhood in ways and to a degree which are entirely beyond the ken of the lower animals. Their capacity for good is infinite, since they can, if they so desire, make room within themselves for divine reality. But at the same time, their capacity for evil, not indeed infinite, since evil is always ultimately self-destructive and therefore temporary, but uniquely great. Hell is total separation from God, and the devil is the will to that separation. Being rational and free, human beings are capable of being diabolic. This is a feat which no animal can duplicate, for no animal is sufficiently clever, sufficiently purposeful, sufficiently strong-willed, or sufficiently moral to be a devil. We should note that, to be diabolic on the grand scale, one must, like Milton's Satan, exhibit in a high degree all the moral virtues except only charity and wisdom. Man's capacity to crave more violently than any animal for the intensification of his separateness results not only in moral evil and the sufferings which moral evil inflicts in one way or another upon the victims of evil and the perpetrators of it, but also in certain characteristically human derangements of the body. Animals suffer mainly from contagious diseases, which assume epidemic proportions whenever the urge to reproduction combines with exceptionally favorable circumstances to produce overcrowding, and from diseases due to infestation by parasites. These last are simply a special case of the sufferings that must inevitably arise when many species of creatures coexist and can only survive at one another's expense. Civilized man has been fairly successful in protecting himself against these plagues, but in their place he has called up a formidable array of degenerative diseases hardly known among the lower animals. Most of these degenerative diseases are due to the fact that civilized human beings do not, on any level of their being, live in harmony with Tao, or the divine nature of things. They love to intensify their selfhood through gluttony, therefore eat the wrong food and too much of it. They inflict upon themselves chronic anxiety over money, and, because they crave excitement, chronic overstimulation. They suffer, during their working hours, from the chronic boredom and frustration imposed by the sort of jobs that have to be done in order to satisfy the artificially stimulated demand for the fruits of fully mechanized mass production. Among the consequences of these wrong uses of the psychophysical organism are degenerative changes in particular organs, such as the heart, kidneys, pancreas, intestines, and arteries, asserting their partial selfhood in a kind of declaration of independence from the organism as a whole. The degenerating organs cause suffering to themselves and their physiological environment. In exactly the same way, the human individual asserts his own partial selfhood and separateness from his neighbors, from nature and God, with disastrous consequences to himself, his family, his friends, and society in general. And reciprocally, a disordered society, professional group or family, living by a false philosophy, influences its members to assert their individual selfness and separateness, just as the wrong-living and wrong-thinking individual influences his own organs to assert, by some excess or defect of function, their partial selfhood at the expense of the total organism. The effects of suffering may be morally and spiritually bad, neutral or good, according to the way in which the suffering is endured or reacted to. In other words, it may stimulate in the sufferer a conscious or unconscious craving for the intensification of his separateness, or it may leave the craving such as it was before the suffering, or finally, it may mitigate it and so become a means for advance towards self-abandonment and the love and knowledge of God. Which of these three alternatives shall be realized depends, in the last analysis, upon the sufferer's choice. This seems to be true even on the subhuman level. The higher animals, at any rate, often seem to resign themselves to pain, sickness, and death with a kind of serene acceptance of what the divine nature of things has decreed for them. But in other cases, there is panic fear and struggle, a frenzied resistance to those decrees. To some extent, at last, the embodied animal itself appears to be free, in the face of suffering, to choose self-abandonment or self-assertion. For embodied human selves, this freedom of choice is unquestionable. The choice of self-abandonment and suffering makes possible the reception of grace on the spiritual level, in the formative accession of the love and knowledge of God, and grace in the mental and physiological levels, in the form of a diminution of fear, self-concern, and even of pain. When we conceive the love of suffering, we lose the sensibility of the senses, and dead we will live in that garden. St. Catherine of Siena. He who lives for love does not suffer, for all suffering is forgot. In this life there is not purgatory, but only heaven or hell. For he who bears afflictions with patience has paradise, and he who does not has hell. St. Philip Neri. Most sufferings are the immediate consequence of moral evil, and these cannot have any good effects upon the sufferer, so long as the causes of his distress are not eradicated. Each sin begetteth a special spiritual suffering. A suffering of this kind is like unto that of hell, for the more you suffer, the worse you become. This happeneth to sinners. The more they suffer through their sins, the the more wicked they become, and they fall continually more and more into their sins in order to get free from their suffering, the following of Christ. The idea of vicarious suffering has too often been formulated in crudely juridical and commercial terms. A has committed an offense for which the law decrees a certain punishment. B voluntarily undergoes the punishment. Justice and the lawgiver's honor are satisfied. Consequently, A may go free. Or else it is all a matter of debts and repayments. A owes C a sum of money which he cannot repay. B steps in with the cash and prevents C from foreclosing on the mortgage. Applied to the facts of man's suffering and his relations to the divine ground, these conceptions are neither enlightening nor edifying. The orthodox doctrine of the atonement attributes to God characteristics that would be discreditable even to a human potentate, and its model of the universe is not the product of spiritual insight rationalized by philosophic reflection, but rather the projection of a lawyer's fantasy. But in spite of these deplorable crudities in their formulation, the idea of vicarious suffering and the other closely related idea of the transferability of merit are based upon genuine facts of experience. The selfless and God-filled person can and does act as a channel through which grace is able to pass into the unfortunate being who has made himself impervious to the divine by habitual craving for intensification of his own separateness and selfhood. It is because of this that the saints are able to exercise authority, all the greater for being entirely non-compulsive, over their fellow beings. They transfer merit to those who are in need of it. But that which converts the victim of self-will and puts them on the path of liberation is not the merit of the saintly individual. A merit that consists in his having made himself capable of eternal reality as a pipe, by being cleaned out, is made capable of water. It is rather the divine charge he carries, the eternal reality for which he has become the conduit. And similarly, in vicarious suffering, it is not the actual pains experienced by the saint which are redemptive. For to believe that God is angry at sin and that his anger cannot be propitiated except by the offer of a certain sum of pain is to blaspheme against the divine nature. No, what saves is the gift from beyond the temporal order brought to those imprisoned in selfhood by these selfless and God-filled persons who have been ready to accept suffering in order to help their fellows. The Bodhisattva's vow is a promise to forego the immediate fruits of enlightenment and to accept rebirth and its inevitable concomitants, pain and death, again and again, until such time as, thanks to his labors, and the graces of which, being selfless, he is the channel, and the sentient beings shall have come to the final and complete deliverance. I saw a mass of matter of a dull, gloomy color between the north and the east, and was informed that this mass was human beings, in as great as misery as they could be and live, and that I was mixed up with them, and henceforth I must not consider myself as a distinct or separate being. Why must the righteous and the innocent endure undeserved suffering? For anyone who conceives of human individuals as Hume conceived of events and things as loose and separate, the question admits of no acceptable answer. But in fact, human individuals are not loose and separate, and the only reason why we think they are is our own wrongly interpreted self-interest. We want to do what we damn well like, to have a good time and have no responsibilities. Consequently, we find it convenient to be misled by the inadequacies of language and to believe, not always of course, but just when it suits us, that things, persons, and events are completely distinct and separate from one another as to the words by means of which we think about them. That things, persons, and events are as completely distinct and separate from one another as the words by means of which we think about them. The truth is, of course, that we are all organically related to God, to nature, and to our fellow men. If every human being were constantly and consciously in a proper relationship with his divine, natural, and social environments, there would be only so much suffering as creation makes inevitable. But actually, most human beings are chronically in an improper relation to God, nature, and some at least of their fellows. The results of these wrong relationships are the manifest on the social level as wars, revolutions, exploitation, and disorder. On the natural level, as waste and exhaustion of irreplaceable resources. On the biological level, as degenerative diseases and the deterioration of racial stocks. On the moral level, as an overweening bumptiousness. And on the spiritual level, as blindness to divine reality and complete ignorance of the reason and purpose of human existence. In such circumstances, it would be extraordinary if the innocent and righteous did not suffer. just as it would be extraordinary if the innocent kidneys and the righteous heart were not to suffer for the sins of a licorice plate and overloaded stomach. Sins, we may add, imposed upon those organs by the will of the gluttonous individual to whom they belong, as he himself belongs to a society which other individuals, his contemporaries and predecessors, have built up into a vast, enduring incarnation of disorder, inflicting suffering upon its members and infecting them with its own ignorance and wickedness. The righteous man can escape suffering only by accepting it and passing beyond it. And he can accomplish this only by being converted from the righteousness to a total selflessness and God-centeredness, by ceasing to be just a Pharisee or good citizen, and becoming perfect as your Father, which in heaven is perfect. The difficulties in the way of such a transfiguration are obviously enormous, but of those who would speak with authority, who has ever said that the road to complete deliverance was easy, or the gate to anything but straight and narrow?